Hey, welcome. Thanks to all of you joining us here in the room and online today. I'm Ruth McCausland. I'm Associate Professor here in the Division of Societal Impact, Equity and Engagement, which is hosting today's In Conversation between Associate Professor Reuben Miller and Peta MacGillivray, in which they'll be exploring the connections between carceral and interpersonal violence and how we can reimagine the concept of justice in this context. I'd like to acknowledge the unceded country that we're gathered on today here in person, Bidjigal country, as well as the country that you're all joining us from online. I pay my deep respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. I also acknowledge the myriad ways that Indigenous people continue to bear the legacies of dispossession and genocide, including through state violence and hyperincarceration, and the ongoing fight of so many in this room and online and elsewhere in the fight for accountability and justice. It's a great privilege to host this event today with these two esteemed scholars. A bit of housekeeping before we get into the meat of the event, or the tofu, or your preferred protein. For those of you who are here in person, the bathrooms, including accessible bathrooms, are located just on the other side of the building in here through the door just next to the kitchen. There'll also be some time for the audience to ask questions of our speakers before the end of the event. And so you can use Slido by visiting slido.com, and the number, which I think is going to be displayed, it is here. That's the code for those of you in the room. Online, if you just add in kind of questions or comments into the chat, Peta will be checking those on her phone. She is paying attention. She's just listening out for your important questions. So captions are being provided by Otter AI and are being shown here in the room. They can also be turned on in Zoom by pressing More and then Show Captions. There'll also be light refreshments served afterwards for those of us who braved the weather, although I'm not looking at Reuben for any kind of weather navigation, because obviously mild, but we're finding it challenging in Sydney. So those of you who are here in person, you are rewarded with refreshments. There's drinks available now if you'd like to access those, and some snacks afterwards. Many thanks to our colleagues in the Division of Societal Impact, Equity and Engagement for their support for this event. In particular, I would also like to thank our fabulous colleague, Izzy Burton-Clark, who has arranged so much of today and is wrangling things from the back of the room. So now, on to briefly introduce Reuben and Peta. Reuben's an Associate Professor in the University of Chicago Crown Family School and in the Department of Race, Diaspora and Indigeneity, and a Research Professor at the American Bar Foundation. He's also a MacArthur Fellow. His research examines how racialised and poor people experience law, crime control and social welfare policy. His first book, Halfway Home, Race, Punishment and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration, is based on 15 years of research and practice with currently and formerly incarcerated men and women, their families, partners and friends in Chicago, Detroit and a number of cities across the United States. He's currently conducting a transnational study of Black emancipation in port cities across the transatlantic slave trade route, and a study of violence and our responses to it across the globe. He's in Sydney to provide a keynote address at the 17th Reintegration Puzzle Conference this Friday. Many of us in the room have the pleasure of attending that. Very exciting. Peta Ivy MacGillivray is a Kalkatungu South Sea Islander lawyer and researcher, and the Yuwaya Ngarra-li Senior Research Fellow based here at UNSW. Peta's worked as a researcher on a range of criminology, legal services and community development projects in New South Wales and across Australia. Peta's former area of legal practice and current PhD research focuses on the criminalisation of Indigenous children and young people with intellectual disability experiencing social and economic disadvantage. Over to you both.
Thank you, Ruth. Welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal elders and traditional owners of this country. And as a Kalkatungu and Australian South Sea Islander woman, I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. And I've been on this campus now for quite a while, studying and working and building community here, and pay deep respects to elders and Aboriginal people who've joined us today. Reuben, thank you so much for being here. Before we really get into it, I just wanted to ask you, my best friend and I have a radio show on community radio here in Sydney on 2SER. It's called Blacksiders, and we have been pondering each week our favorite soups because it's winter and it's quite cold, as Ruth said, for some of us. I'm from Queensland, so it's cold. Soup, what is your favorite soup? I'll go first. Mine's minestrone. So
Okay. Yeah, my favorite soup, I think, is clam chowder.
Ah,
Clam chowder.
see, that's not something that we get to taste that much of here. So I'll have to come for a visit and
You gotta come through.
yeah.
And it will be clam
Can I
chowder.
ask why clam chowder?
Because on a day like this, it makes you feel warm and cozy. You know, it's nice and viscous and
Yeah, lovely.
it's clam.
Ah,
You know,
okay.
it's
All right, I'm gonna make that my mission for this winter to give it a go.
fantastic.
Okay, so into our conversation this afternoon. Here in Australia, in the last couple of months, we've been through what is a moment that happens occasionally where the whole nation is paying attention to family and domestic violence. This year, it's been due to a series of high-profile homicides where the victims were women and the perpetrators were subject to various police and court-ordered protection orders and things of that nature. In this country, the responsibility for responding to these types of challenges and these events are criminal legal system-led responses, and then harm prevention-led responses. And the responsibility for that falls across state governments and also federal governments. Just recently, just in the last week, we've had, again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, both including women who have been criminalised, have been overlooked again in these responses. So a rapid response expert panel has been put together at the Commonwealth level, and Aboriginal women have been overlooked again, not included, and especially not criminalised women. The CEO of Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service gave evidence in the Yuruk Justice Commission just on Friday about the systemic misidentification of Aboriginal victims as perpetrators by police, saying police were responsible for a unique form of violence against Aboriginal women, whereby their status as genuine victims are devalued. For me, this demonstrates this core question of the harms of state violence being interconnected with interpersonal violence. So I wanted to ask you if you could please share your understandings and from your scholarship and your work and your practice and your life of this relationship between the personal and the structural.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this question quite a bit. And it's, I don't know how to say, on the one hand, it's encouraging that we're paying attention to domestic violence. You know, we need to, and we need to, among communities that have been marginalized for sure. I think about this in part because of the kinds of sentences people get for things like sexual assault, sexual violence, acts of sexual violence, the kinds of response, the criminal justice response or the criminal legal response to men who perpetrate acts of violence, especially acts of sexual harm, for example. In other words, not just talking about sexual harm, we're talking about murder in this case. It's almost always lighter than other forms of violence, except for when it's a person from a marginalized community who's going to get the registry for the rest of their life or something like that. Having said that, thinking about a quote from Malcolm X, you know, who talks about Black women as being the most disrespected women, and we see that in the over policing and under protection of Black women in the U.S. certainly, but other places too apparently. We see that in things like if I think about my own, you asked me to think about in my own context. When I think about questions of things like, so I want to stay on sexual assault for a hot second. You know, there was a New York Times report that was looking at, for example, rape kits, and there was something like 20, 30, 40, 50,000 untested rape kits in the LA Police Department, in the Chicago Police Department, in the New York Police Department, just untested, just laying around. I think about how and why people who've been victims of sexual harm especially don't report the crimes. and how people respond when they don't believe them. So is that this kind of overlay of disbelief because you as a Black woman are not a believable subject. You as a Black woman must have done something to bring about the harm that you're facing. I think about that. And I'm discouraged by that, but I'm glad that people are paying attention to domestic violence because Black women are so underprotected. I'm thinking about the many missing Black girls in the US and other places. Folks who get trafficked and just disappear, for example. Never to be found, never to be looked for. It's taking too long to answer this question, but and then in the case of DV particularly, I think about what happens when Black women fight back. A whole move of folks who fought their assailants and were charged. We could think about the US, but not just the US, a place like the UK, you know, thinking about a woman named Sarah Reed, who famously fought back somebody who assaulted her and was charged with assault. Sarah Reed, there's a long story behind Sarah Reed. I'm not, you know, doing justice to what happened to her. This is a Black woman in the UK who, you know, had lost a baby years before and had tried to bring the baby to the hospital. And because Black women are so disrespected, because their progeny are not viewed as full human beings, she's turned away. She says the baby has trouble breathing. She's turned away. The baby has trouble breathing. She's turned away. The baby eventually dies. She has a nervous breakdown. She's arrested in a Uniqlo 5 years later. A few years after that, you know, this assault happens because she's in a prison, in Holloway prison. She's charged with assault of the person who tried to sexually assault her. She's found dead in her prison cell years later. You know, this is a pattern of not viewing Black women and Black people more generally as being worthy of care, as being worthy of belief, as being worthy of protection. So on the one hand, I'm glad that we're paying attention to that. But I think it's also very important how we attend to these kinds of questions, how we attend to these kinds of problems. And this thread of not paying attention to the group, this thread of not believing Black women shows up in not listening to their voice. So of course they're not invited to give advice. Of course they're not invited to be a voice. Yet again, here we go, to advise government in any formal capacity in the ways that they might respond to the needs that they have. So it's not just like that here. It's also like that in the U.S. But what I'm encouraged by is I'm encouraged by Black women who are leading the movement to change law and policy, both in the United States, in places like the UK, right? And really all over the world. I'm encouraged by folks refusing to be silenced and saying, no, you know, we must be listened to. So when I hear this story, I hear this as a part of a broader pattern and practice, to borrow the words from the police, right? A broader pattern and practice of neglect, a broader pattern and practice of violence itself. And so that's the relationship. When I think about the relationship between interpersonal and state-based violence, I see a misrecognition of vulnerability so often. You know, where I see need and I see need instead of seeing it as need, I see it as threat, and I therefore deploy forces against it. That's what I think when I think about this question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant response, and I think it's a good moment to recognize the incredible Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are not being quiet and are being very loud and using their voice in this time where they are being silenced again, or attempts are being made to silence and exclude them out of, just that ignorance and that neglect. And they, you know, in the last week, the CEO of VALS, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service, the evidence she gave was exactly that situation of Aboriginal women being charged as offenders in situations where they're out defending themselves when they're being victimized.
Yeah.
And just wanted to recognize them and thank them for all of their work and to thank you for your.
It's so very important. No, it's so very important. I think about this, you know, in the US, just think about the US context. Even so on the one hand, there's this moment of domestic violence. So we can think about how we respond to a harm that's happening in the moment. But we can also use this question to think about how we respond to past harms.
Mm.
And, you know, to this point about our response to vulnerability, like deploying police in response to vulnerability, there's an alarming statistic about incarcerated women in the United States that I'd like to sort of bring to the floor. So women in the United States, well over 2/3, it's closer to 83, 84, 85% of women who have been incarcerated in the United States have themselves been the victim of some sort of harm, sexual harm, domestic, and half of them is children.
Yes.
Half of them is children. So why do these folks keep winding up in our jails and prisons is the question that we have to ask ourselves. Why are these the folks that we end up criminalizing? It's because of it's a kind of form of state predation.
Yes.
How do we respond to vulnerability? How do we respond to need? How do we respond to these people when we see them in need? Can we recognize this as need and deploy appropriate forces, maybe forces of protection, maybe forces of care, maybe forces of incorporation? Might be a different way to respond to the kinds of things that we see.
And here in this country, what gets in the way of the appropriate response are things like institutional racism and this particular special type of racism that the systems reserve for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which goes to the core of the nature of colonization that occurred here and the remnants of that and the ongoing practices of colonizing practices that go on because that has never changed. There hasn't been enough shift. There hasn't been enough of attention
to basically
the legacy of that. And so it continues to play out. And we see that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are criminalized as a consequence of the failure of the appropriate response when there has been stress in the family, the presence of domestic violence that doesn't get the appropriate response. Instead, it's a police response, which creates the knock-on effects of all of this intervention, which in all of the cases of speaking to women in prisons has led to that very quick breakdown and intense criminal justice response, often ending up with women in prison. And so that does sound so familiar in terms of that pattern. And often, you know, I think about the risk assessments and the kind of overlay of rationale that results in intervention in people's lives. If those were applied to, or those same kind of critiques were applied to the system's response, of course, there would be Fs all the way through.
Yes.
Thank you for that chat. My next question, making a bit of a shift, is thinking about multidisciplinary practice and research for some of the researchers in the room and online. Your background as a community-based practitioner, a volunteer chaplain within state carceral settings, and then as a researcher and academic must provide a unique perspective to gain insights and understandings about the personal and structural nature of incarceration and punishment. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see this shaping your thinking and writing?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are things that you can see from a distance, and it's really important to have distance from things. Sometimes, you know, I need to, for example, be able to count things. You know, we're taught in the social sciences more or less to make the world strange. So you want to make the world strange so that you don't take for granted everyday practices. And so my primary method of research is through ethnographic practice. I'd follow people, I do what they do, this kind of thing. And so I can see a case for distance. The case for distance is, you know, things that one finds mundane are of interest to folks in the academy for some reason, you know, like, and I think there is something about things that are mundane. I think they're mundane, routine ways that we uphold social inequality, for example. I think they're mundane, routine ways that we engage in acts of violence that we don't think about. So for example, they're mundane and routine ways that we learn to overlook the harms that we've caused to people that we've harmed forever. It's just a part of how we do government. It's a part of how we do social life. It's every day. My disrespect, my inability to hear what a woman at all has to say, let alone a Black woman, let alone an Indigenous, name, let alone them. I listen to me, whoever the me is. Okay, so there's that. So okay, so there's some value in distance, but there's some value in proximity too. So a part of my proximity is the work that I did. So I was a volunteer chaplain at the Cook County Jail. I remember the first day I started work. It was time for lunch at the jail. And this is a jail that holds about 10,000 people on any given day. And it was the largest single site jail facility in the country. And of course, you know, I'm in the United States, so this is a country where mass incarceration is happening. And so there are around 2 million people. There's things that are familiar to some people and maybe not so familiar. So just allow me to say, like, so there are about 2 million people in a jail or prison in the United States on any given day. And in my city, this jail for us is short-term detention. And long-term detention goes to prison. In the jail, there'd be 10,000 people in any given day. That number is reduced to about 8,000 now, but at the time I was visiting, this is the height of mass incarceration, it's 2003 to 2008. Anyway, my first day on the inside, I'm told to go in a cell and go hang out with some guys. And this is the case for proximity. And it's, quote, feeding time. Feeding time, like these are cattle. Then the language that would flow in this place would be like feeding time, meds. So it's feeding time, and I walk in the jail, and the guard walks out, and all the brothers stand up, and I have no idea why they're standing up, and they start walking toward me, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, and behind me is the brother who's coming behind, who's bringing lunch. They're not walking toward me at all. They're walking to the brother who's bringing lunch. So a moment where I felt afraid, and perhaps it was reasonable for me to feel afraid, was a moment that was produced by the way folks eat.
Yeah.
Something I would have never seen had I not gotten close. Well, how did he feed them? How did feeding time happen? The lunch was carried in a black plastic garbage bag. What was the lunch? Stale bread, bologna, and orange. Something I would never see if I wasn't there. Something I might not believe. You know, if you say to me, a jail is a dehumanizing place, I can believe you. But if I walk past the same broken pipe every day, you can say to me, jail is an unclean place, I might believe you. But if I smell for myself, you know, unwashed jumpsuits, cigarettes, stomach flu that circulates in people who are made to live in batches like animals, then I understand it in a very different way. My proximity allows me that. Well, there's another kind of proximity that was allowed. So that was through practice, which I think is valuable. I think sometimes you just got to get close to people and you understand what they're talking about. And then the jail is the place that you make a decision about whether or not you plead your case or whether or not you take it to court and how long you take it. No wonder people take, in my country, plea bargains are the way people, like, they plea out to everything. Of course they do. They sit in a space like that.
That happens.
A space that I'm afraid of. Yeah. Right? But another form of proximity was in my family. So I'm from a country where after 1972, we engaged in an experiment in human caging where we arrest more people each year than we did the year before at a higher rate than we did the year before. And those people happen to all be, or just about, most of those people happen to be poor and Black. Now, I'm poor and Black born after 1972, the year this starts. So this means everybody I know, every other person I know is going to jail or prison. So I'm a volunteer chaplain, I'm close, I'm hanging out. I start seeing my neighbors show up. People from my neighborhood, of course they showed up. And then eventually my brother gets incarcerated. And he had been arrested before, but I started paying attention in a very different way when I was doing this work. And that taught me something. What it meant to love somebody who was in a cage. Taught me something about family separation, about longing, about writing letters, about bad responses, about terrible attorneys, about well-meaning attorneys who are overstaffed and overworked. I learned something very different being close to a thing about what prison food tasted like for him and why he's demolishing a soybean burger or whatever the thing is. Nothing wrong with soybean, you know, your protein of choice. We just talked about that. But what it meant for this guy, but I know this guy. I know he should think that food's nasty. Yeah. Like being close to him taught me something very different. And so I think the things that you learn from a distance, but proximity helps me to understand the social world in a very different way. It helps me to see things that I'm asking questions I would have never asked had I not been close to it. The problem is the academy tells me that my knowledge isn't valid because I'm close.
Mhm.
That I'm tainted because I'm close. And so my professional project has been to say, no, you're wrong. I know things you can't know because I'm close.
Thank you. I feel the same way as somebody who is working in this institution, but works in community, has lived experience of the exact things that I talk about day in, day out, and apply that knowledge. Don't always disclose it, don't always think that's important, and sometimes it's not safe to, but it is, you here in this country, it plays out as objectivity.
Yes.
So being more
Yes.
objective to be able to make that critique or make that contribution, completely raising the importance of exactly what you've so wonderfully shared today. Yeah, that's so wonderful. Thank you. I will be going back and re-watching the recording. Staying on the research and methodology line for a little bit, your research and building on what we've just talked about, your research and scholarship is grounded in the experiences of the people who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, and the impacts of their perpetual punishment long after they've left carceral institutions. Your research quantifies and makes visible all the ways the social and welfare policies creates what you've called a supervised society.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us about why this approach of quantifying the problem is important and why you've taken that approach? So in what ways is it different from purely reporting on incarceration rates and those types of more traditional quantifying methods?
Yeah, I'm very interested in the texture of social. I think social policy isn't just something that governments do, it's something that's experienced that people live in. So a political decision that's made in the halls of power shows up in communities in powerful ways, sometimes in wonderful ways, oftentimes in not so wonderful ways. And so I think you have to really dig into the texture of a social situation to understand it. I think you have to identify things and use plain language and try your best to capture a social situation so that we know how to confront it. I think that without that, you can't do anything about it at all. So for example, I can tell you that there are 2 million people who are held in a cage, and maybe the language of a cage is strong enough or shocking enough, or might move us to action, but what action? I think it's important for us to know what it's like to be in the cage. What does the cage look like? What does it smell like? What does it feel? The visceral. What does it feel like?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, there's the rate. On the other hand, there's the experience. On the one hand, there's the fact of it. On the other hand, there's the question of what it means for us to engage in these practices at all. What does this tell me about me? Mm-hmm. What does the brother I don't know being in that cage say about me? Say about what I support? Say about my moral compass? So those are ethical questions.
Yeah.
You're asking questions about quantification. So what then do I count? And what counts as valuable? Who counts as valuable? Like these are the kinds of questions that I wrestle with in my work. And so I think it's exceptionally important for us to dig into a social fact.
Yeah.
And to get at the meat of it.
And one of the, if I can cut in just a minute,
No, of course you can.
In the excellent TED Talk that's online, almost 2 million views, you actually give the number of different guidelines and laws that prevent people from being able to rebuild their lives once they're back in their community.
Yes.
And that kind of infrastructure of limitations has been able to grow over time without any reflection or thinking about how to change that, and the work that can be undone, but we need to make it visible. We need to actually, I see that as useful quantifying. So rather than just keep counting how many women are dying each year, let's count all of the systemic failings and actually get deep into quantifying that so we can identify where we can actually take some action to more action and less kind of counting. But I think we need to count, but what matters, right?
No, I appreciate that point and that clarification. And yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so So once you get close to a thing, you start seeing different things. You know, you see different things. And understanding something about the size of the thing that you're looking at really does matter. Understanding something about the scale of the thing really does matter. It's important for us to see the folks who are in jails and prisons. It's important for us to count the number of people. It's important for us to know how many people are dying, who's missing, who's been taken from home. It's important for us to know that.
I mean, as a lawyer, I think about, and Gemma McKinnon, my best friend and I who have our radio show, we often engage in these questions as lawyers thinking about, okay, well, the narrow scope of the, of litigation allows us to do some work and that can have huge impact. But with our knowledge and expertise, the analysis of the system that could actually emerge a new set of goals that help us reach our ultimate goal are there. But I feel there's just not enough engagement in those questions. And what I appreciate about your work is in the proximity, you can find real action that can make a difference. But we don't have enough people who are in proximity for reasons which, I'd kind of leave with you all to think about and reflect on yourselves. But yeah, that's kind of how I think.
Can we sit with one of these reasons? So one of the reasons why we for example, the American Bar Association tabulated the laws and policies that targeted people with criminal records. One of the reasons why we weren't paying attention to that is because we just didn't care about these people. So we didn't care that in the so just to stay in the US for a hot second and to stay with this question of quantification, which raises new questions about what does this thing that we've built mean? One of the reasons why people didn't care, people thought they knew that, oh, okay, people with criminal records have a hard time finding a job. So what does that mean in real life? Like, why do they have that? Why is that hard time the case? The hard time is the case in part because of the stigma associated with people with criminal records. The hard time is also because of a set of public policy decisions that were made. 18,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that target people with criminal records for the fact of employment alone. 18,000 restrictions on employment, including liability stuff. So this is a different thing to pay attention. So like a point about things you look at. So like, why doesn't the guy with the, why can't I why can't the guy with the record get a job? The guy with the record can't get a job because the employer will get sued if the guy with the record makes a mistake. And the guy with the record, the employer is afraid of the guy with the record making a mistake because the whole world is afraid of the guy with the record making a mistake. And then policy gets written in such a way that justifies a set of fears. And produces new kinds of fears. And therefore new kinds of values get right. Like so then to be a good employer is to exclude people with records. To be a good landlord is to keep people who've broken the law away from my house. To be a good person is now to harm someone else. So I've got to count that. I've got to see that. I've got to feel that. I've got to understand that. So I see what new kinds of harms I produce when I'm trying to make this new and better world, which is what we say the goal is at every moment. We're going to reform systems because we want to make them better. How do I reform? What are the consequences of a gift? This doesn't mean move to inaction. It's to pay attention to the actions that we engage in.
And that thing of the consequences is playing out in Australia with the criminalisation of coercive control, which is this new crime that will be legislated here in New South Wales. And there was a huge amount of work and effort led by Aboriginal scholars and activists, women who said, this is going to be a disaster. The consequences of this will be so significant. We will see Aboriginal women, prison populations, grow. There's evidence of this pattern from other jurisdictions internationally. And yes, this insistence to have a criminal justice-led response to things which require a social response, require an appropriate safety response that doesn't involve police. That's an opportunity lost, and we'll be again having to react and find ways to deal with something that we knew was going to happen. I'm loving this. How much time have we got left? Okay, we're good. All right, we're going okay.
I'm
All right.
long-winded. You gotta forgive me. I'm like, if you tee it up, I gotta, you know.
I've got one more question
Let's do
on the academic research side of things, and then we're going to pivot into something else.
Sure.
But it's the question of the role of criminology.
Yeah.
Debates have been surfaced in Australia, not new debates, in the discipline of criminology and its accountability to hyper-incarcerated groups of people in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in communities, including women and children, which particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who are incarcerated, those numbers staying the same, where you see decreases in the youth prison population elsewhere, adults and children with disability and people experiencing intergenerational poverty. As I mentioned, these are not new debates. However, I'm keen to get your thoughts on the role of critical criminology and sociology. What do you say should be the focus for our future contributions?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I want to walk into critical criminology, sociology. I'd like to first say this is our hatred of the vulnerable. This is our predation. This is our form of predation. It's like I haven't seen a single society, and so where the strong don't prey on the weak, and this is the temptation that we have to resist. I think this is my position. We have to resist the temptation to prey on the weak when we're in a position of power, where we don't use our leverage to cause harm to somebody who's in a weaker position than we're in. You know, it's like when we see I was talking to there's a sister who does advocacy work in the States. This powerful activist, Jody Polk, who worked on the campaign to restore voting rights. So we have a problem with voting rights in the U.S. and there are a couple states that completely restrict people who've had criminal justice contact from the ability to vote under certain circumstances. And she won the right to help win the right to vote. Or she worked on the campaign to help win the right to vote back for people in the state, Florida, a really important state for the electorate in the U.S. Anyway, she tells this awful story about, her inability to find a place to stay. So I'm walking into the role of critical, I promise. Yep. Anyway, and so she got out of prison. She had committed a violent crime. She got out of prison and was, became this activist and had done glorious work and is incredible. And she's this gifted speaker and had fans who would follow her as she gave these speeches. One in particular who came up to her and was like, how can I help? How can I help you? How can I help you? And she's like, yo, I can't find a place to stay. I got kids. I need a place to stay. And this woman's like, hey, I own a bunch of properties. Why don't you stay on one of my properties? This is great because it was almost impossible for her to rent. She had committed an offense that was violent, made it very hard. And so the woman allowed her to stay and rent from her, allowed her to rent from her. This language is wild. Anyway, the woman allowed her to rent an apartment from her. So she rents the apartment. And the apartment has fleas and something called wolf spiders, which you all are like, Australia, y'all got big things, right? Like, so like you in the US, not so much, right? We hear these things, we freak out. You all have anyway, the apartment has fleas and the kinds of things that you all aren't typically afraid of, but we are. And so these big spiders with hair, if you've got hair, you're no longer an insect, you're like something else. Anyway. And so she tells the woman, she's like, yo, the apartment's got fleas and wolf spiders. And she says, you're lucky to have a place at all. And then she goes around to other landlords in the area and she talks about my friend as a difficult woman and a hard person to help. Yeah. Anyway. A part of our role I think a part of the role of critical social science is to think about moral and ethical questions too. Mm-hmm. What does it mean to be critical? What does it mean to be radical? What does it mean to think carefully about things like state harm, things like leverage, things like power? That's our job. Our job, if you call yourself a critical scholar, your job is to think about the role of power, who uses it, how is it wielded, and your job is to think about the margin. for the less critical discipline of sociology. Sociology is itself not a critical discipline. It's just a social science like everything else. But I would say that folks who think about the human condition have to think about questions of marginality, which means to think about questions of power, which means to grapple with what it means to live in a system that has been racialized, that is class-based, that is hierarchical, where leverage is wielded in such a way that situations like this happen. So that we can look at this with a clear-eyed analysis of what's going down. How and why is this landlord in a position to do this to this woman? How and why is this woman in the position to experience this in this way? Who are the individual bad actors who are doing it? I think you got to name names.
Yeah.
You know, but also what are the systemic factors that put her in this position? Perhaps it's the 1,000 laws, policies, and administrative sanctions that prevent people with criminal records from renting places in the United States. Perhaps it's the stigma that circulates around questions of violence, as if people who commit acts of harm aren't human beings themselves. Perhaps it's our inability to recognize vulnerability itself. Perhaps it's our predation against the vulnerable and the impulse that we have to prey on people that we can. And we see this in moments when people can. Every kind of genocide, every moment of war, we see this interaction between people where the strong, I'm thinking about stories about, like the Yugoslav war, where Serbian teachers, are marching their neighbors and mistreating them off to jails and prisons. And they're like, yo, you were my teacher. I knew you for years and years and years. We speak the same language. You knew my neighbors. How did you do that? Because of this, I think it's not an impulse. It's not a human impulse, but it's what people do when they're put in positions of power over other people. And when you don't check that impulse, when you don't check it, I'm a religious guy, and I think there's something I try to live by, which is like there's a phrase that we say in the Black church especially, which is like, but by the grace of God go I, like this idea of like that could be me, I could be the worst, that could be my position. I try my best to remember that, and I think that sociology, critical criminology could remember that these are human beings, and the analysis has to take into consideration questions of power. And if you're taking into consideration questions of power, you have to think about the marginalized. If you think about the marginalized, you need to take a side.
Yeah.
It's okay to take a side.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
That
was a long walk. That was too long of a walk, but
no, it was a wonderful walk, and I enjoyed myself on that nice stroll. Because I mean, my own personal reflection is that I find myself in particularly conferences and things like that amongst criminologists, and I just think, what a strange discipline for you to fall into with the views that you have. If you're not interested in kind of doing good, what are you doing here? But yes, and I think that is, people do forget that. It's very closely related to the objectivity, proximity conversation. I hope those people watch this recording, but maybe we can send it to them. Okay, so now I'd like to, again, I've done well preparing because these are building on each other quite nicely.
Great job.
The question I've got now is about advocacy, activism, and law reform.
I'm all about it.
Excellent. On your visit here to Australia for the Reintegration Puzzle Conference, you'll be presenting a keynote on the politics of radical hospitality. We won't give too much away for that one, but I wondered if you could please sneak peek an overview of that idea by relating to the role of advocacy, radical politics, and radical action in welfare policy and law reform in our current reality of penal populism.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, radical hospitality is a Catholic social justice teaching. This is where I first encounter it. I mean, there's literature on it. Migration folks take up questions of radical hospitality, and the question is really like, what practices does one engage in to allow like for people who to create a space of welcome. Like, what does it mean to bring in the stranger? And what it means to bring in a stranger, like the radical part of it, is to make yourself vulnerable in some ways. And I think vulnerability, this thing we've been talking about quite a lot, is something that we run away from, especially in law and policy. Like we're overwhelmingly preoccupied with safety, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't be, But I'm saying that we're overwhelmingly preoccupied with safety. So we do stuff where we distance ourselves from people who've caused harm, from people who have the potential to cause harm. See, where it's starting to get dangerous.
Yeah.
From people who I think I have a good reason to be afraid of. I keep them at a distance. And so the question is, what does it mean to invite someone in? What does it mean to make a space for someone? What does it mean to put yourself out? And what do you get when you do it? Well, I've been spending time in violence intervention spaces for the last couple years. You know, just some of it lightweight. I'm starting to do it more systematically now. And so I've been spending a lot of time. A lot of that time has been with organizations that work with young people who've shot or at risk of shooting other people. And so these young shooters, the question for the violence intervention program is, how do I get this guy to put down their gun? And so I talked to young shooters who have put down their guns, for example. And I asked them, how and why did you do that? Why did you put down your gun? Well, so talk about hospitality and talk about the vulnerability associated with this. So talk about the hospitality part. They say, because of this. Well, what's this? What are you doing in the this? Well, right now, I'm in an arts group. I'm in an arts group. The brother will talk about the work that you do, you know, wood carving and the arts on your panel at the conference that I'd like to plug that everybody should go to. You know what I mean? But like the guy, you know, they're doing an arts group. It's not a cognitive behavioral intervention to try to get people to think right. You know, it's not group therapy necessarily, though people need it, right? Like people need, it's arts. It's learn how to use a 3D printer. It's painting. They're not great painters, like these are stick figures. It's not like beautiful work or something like that. It's crafts. Why does that matter? Then I go a little deeper. So why does that matter? So I talked to a brother who had gotten out of prison a couple years before, who had struggled to find work, struggled to get on his feet. He was a young guy. And I asked him why he didn't pick his gun back up. Why don't you go back to the old life? How come you're not selling dope anymore? How come you're not? He said, because of that brother right there. So first he said, this place is a lifeline to me. Then he says, that brother right there. Well, what did that brother do? Because at 2 a.m, when I'm stressing out and I can't figure out how to get through, he picks up the phone. He puts himself out for me. And what about this group? He talks about the value that he finds in the group and the value that people in the group find in him.
That belonging.
That belonging. There's a place here for me. This organization made a place for me. I'm a guy who shot people. If the funders of this organization find out that they made a place for me, they might cut their funding. They took a risk. I'm a guy who shot people. They value me. Oh, they put me in a position of leadership. They put me over all the kids in this group. I talk to these youngins here. There's a role for me. And not just a role at the bottom, there's puzzles for me to solve. How do I help these kids now not pick up their guns? There's something that I can do with my mind. There's a challenge for me. They believe in me so much, they give me a hard job, not flipping a burger. Nothing wrong with flipping a burger. Flip burgers, flip mad burgers, like feed your family, do what you gotta do. But they give me a tough job. They allow me a challenge. We learned this is a basic human need to solve puzzles, for example. You know, and so when spaces are made for people to belong, when people take risks on other people and put themselves out, this is the form of hospitality that I'm talking about. And what do we see over and over again? The organizations that are successful in getting kids to put down their guns engage in these kinds of practices. But that's not how they get funded. They get funded for the cognitive behavioral intervention. They get funded for the number of bodies that have moved through the space, the count. They get funded for the treatment that they put them through. But they don't get funded for this hospitable move, this politic of welcome they engage in. And so part of what I'm trying to do is highlight those kinds of works.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I feel like there's even an application for the idea in the civil society organizations that have a lot of power and influence that could be practicing radical hospitality, particularly of criminalized people,
100%.
and actually saying, no, we need the people who need this at the center of this work.
Well, you need them for 1,000 reasons.
Yeah.
But one of which is not because people who've been touched by the criminal justice system have a preternatural instinct.
Yes.
It's because they have an experience. There's an experience, and then once you meet experience with training,
yes,
you know, once these two things come together, experience and training, you get impact. You
Yes.
you get something very impactful in the lives of other people, for themselves, and also for others. Yeah.
And in our work, we see that as the piece of effort, again, unfunded and not very sexy. So there's not many people kind of concerning themselves with doing it, but that capability and capacity piece, not in a kind of condescending way, but in a very practical, you know, how are we training? How are we resourcing? How are we helping people to give people the tools for what they need to do what we know could be kind of completely different?
Yes.
And valuing that as being critical to the work as well.
And making space for these folks to lead.
Yes.
This is super important. Make space. We got to make space for people with lived experience of all kinds.
Yes.
To lead, which is again another form of vulnerability, because I want to lead.
Yeah.
You know, so my egos, I might think about things differently. This is a challenge to my ego. It's a challenge to my paycheck.
Yeah.
I want to lead because being the executive director has a different kind of salary than being the frontline worker.
Yeah.
You know, but folks have to be in positions of leadership if we want to see like real change, if we want to allow for any kind of, and then the radicality will be doing things in ways that we haven't done it before, breaking out of old patterns, thinking very differently about how the world, for example, could operate. It's from these places that I might extract lessons for a new world. You know, and there's a history here that I can draw from to do that.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, just to do a little shout out to my colleague Ruth McCausland, we have this conversation in this idea of biodegradable leadership. So particularly in settings where there are people that have worked for a long time and making great contributions, and thinking about how you can move out of that space so that people can be stepping up and coming into that. Particularly in community settings, and how important that is as part of the succession planning. In Aboriginal community controlled organisations, we do have an aging leadership, and there will be this transition that's coming of incredibly impressive and hardworking leaders who will need to step aside to let more people kind of have a go. And so these questions of succession and those crucial conversations to aid that, you know, it's something which I'm personally thinking and reflecting on all of the time. Okay, so on this, just one question. Let me just do a little time check. Oh, okay. I might prioritize a question. Actually, this is the last question, which is on social cooperation and working with government to affect change. Here in Australia, we have a mechanism at a national level, a national government agreement to close the gap on the disparity of social outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It's called the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. So all Australian governments have signed up to it. And in New South Wales, there is a state agreement which enables Aboriginal community controlled organisations to work closely with public servants in the New South Wales government to practice different ways of working to achieve law and policy reform. It's an approach that relies heavily on significant community organisation capability and capacity, and a willingness from bureaucracies to work differently, practicing different behaviours and logics to shift accountability back to achieving outcomes for neglected communities. So people living in poverty and people that are being criminalised by this intensity of criminal justice-led responses. It's an ambitious policy and practice approach that doesn't have any legal structural mechanism that supports the Indigenous side of the agreement. And at a basic level requires a lot of social cooperation. Can I ask you to share your views on what you would say it takes to cooperate across multiple systems and stakeholder groups in a climate of fear and criminogenic risk assessments, which are put up as the solution to what are structural problems?
Thank you. So I think that directly impacted people need to be in leadership, just period. Like that's my position. And so because of that, I think that there is, and I don't mean in leadership in absence of people who don't have direct impact with the problem. I think that like 1,000 flowers bloom together, we all get in the room. We cannot exclude directly impacted people from leading. And so initiatives to foster that have a benefit. Initiatives to foster that overly rely on the already strained capacities of community-based actors and organizations produce a new kind of problem where you're stretching thin, already thinly stretched resources, where you're pushing a problem of imagination off of government onto groups of people who have been harmed by acts of government. I talk about this in my academic writing, which I don't expect anybody to read, but like as like I talk about like something called the carceral devolution. It's like the devolution of state responsibility onto community-based actors. It's one of the things that happens when we allow for folks to fetishize community and minimize government. I think that government-sized problems need government-sized solutions, meaning that if you're going to rely on community-based actors and organizations, you have to fund community-based actors and organizations to help. So if you rely on social cooperation, you have to support social cooperation to allow for it to work well. And therefore, we need both state level government sized funding for things, government sized support for things, including technical assistance. But we also need actors outside of the state to agitate. So social movement actors and organizers to agitate for support for things that the government decides to do. I think all of it has to happen together. So
the time it takes to actually build and ensure that where that expertise and knowledge is coming from the community, it's a resources of like real resources, but also time resources as well.
100%. You can't do this in 6 months.
Yeah, or 3 years. It's a long-term effort, and that be realistic about that.
Yes.
Yeah,
that's what I think.
Thank you so much. We have maybe one question time for one question.
Okay.
So the lucky person who's used our Slido, you'll know who you are soon when I check. I don't think, oh, here we go. All right. And there's one that's been starred. So I'm going to ask this one. It's from our friend, Patrick McGee. ICCPR recently found Australia had tortured a First Nations man with disability indefinitely detained. What advice do you have for Australian civil society and how to address structural apathy to arbitrary detention and cruel and inhumane degrading treatment?
Yeah, I'm sad to hear that, and I want to express concern and care for that person and their family. And people who connected to them and to the community that suffers when things like this happen. There's public health research that tells us, when there's deaths in custody, when community hears about, sort of just like for things like police torture, things like even things as minimal as there's really interesting public health research on things like police stops, so in communities where police stops, like after 3 stops, there's a nominal kind of mental health effect. After the 4th or 5th, the negative mental health effect is off the charts. It harms these kinds of intrusions, harm community in powerful, interesting ways. I think a couple things have to happen. One is people have to talk about it, which is why this person raises this question, or part of the reason why they raise this question. Awareness is really important. The second is like narrative change work is really very important. So I think you challenge apathy. You have to challenge apathy. You have to make normal the value of people we've marginalized, and especially people we've thrown away. And so that's the work of journalists. I think there has to be a careful campaign. And I understand that, you know, there are like one or two options for like mainstream news in this country. And I understand that, and I know there are limitations, but you talked to me the other day about Aboriginal journalist collectives and independent journalists who are working together to change the narrative and push a new ideas about the value of human life, for example. I think that's critically important. But I think this is one of those situations where you can't give up, where you have to shout as loud as you can about the inhumanity of one, systems of control anyway. You know, so like, what does it mean to be in a cage anyway? Like, people need to know what it means to be in a cage anyway. You need to shout that from the rooftops so that everybody understands that being in a cage is actually being in a cage and what comes with that. But certainly, and in cases of this, where we challenge people's behaviors based on ideas of human dignity and a shared human experience. I think these are really important things that have to happen. It's not a specific answer, but it's a part of this larger push to treat people who've made mistakes and people who haven't as human beings. This is, I think, the move that we have to engage in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I think that's a good place for us to finish. If I can just thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for such a wonderful conversation that you've shared with me this afternoon, and all of the people that have come, and to everybody online. And I'm really looking forward to seeing you again at the Reintegration Puzzle Conference and your keynote. And I hope that you've been able to enjoy yourself a bit as well.
It's been wonderful. Thank you for the great conversation.
Thanks, Reuben.
Thank you. Thank you.